Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is called Navigating the Federal Job Search Process, featuring Janice Lachance, Executive Vice President of Strategic and Organizational Excellence here at the American Geophysical Union. I'm Nathaniel Janik, and I will be your host today. I am the Career Services Coordinator here at AGU. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few items to help facilitate the experience. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box, and it's in the right side control panel. We'll answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation, and if we can't get to them all, then we'll answer them offline. Slides for today's webinar can be accessed by clicking on the Handouts tab on the control panel and then clicking on the document to download it. There are actually two different handouts. We have slides and then a list of some helpful links at OPM and USAJOBS.gov. Also, we may be using the hand-raising function today, so just to make sure everybody knows how to use it, if you go to your control panel on the top left corner, you should see an image of a hand. And if you see that hand, go ahead and click on it to raise your hand. And so if everybody in the audience could go ahead and click on that. I see a few folks raising it. Yeah, Christine, Brendan. Yeah. All right, so those of you who've seen it, that's how you see it. I'm going to put everybody's hands down now. If there are any yes/no questions throughout, we may be using it, so just know where that is. And then finally, the link to the online recording of this webinar is going to be sent to all attendees in a follow-up email in just a few days. Again, presenting today's webinar is Janice Lachance. I'm going to pass the mic over to Janice now. Take it away, Janice.
Oh, thank you, Nathaniel. I just want to welcome everybody as a start here, and thank you all for joining us. You may wonder why an executive vice president at AGU knows anything about hiring in the federal government, and that's mostly because I am the former director of the Office of Personnel Management, which, if you're interested in federal employment, you may know has government-wide authority for human resources, for the merit system, for hiring, retirement, healthcare, basically the HR office for the federal government. When I got that job, I was a political appointment and a member of President Clinton's cabinet. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me and a wonderful time. And I have been able to maintain my knowledge to a great extent about the federal hiring process, and am an unabashed enthusiast for federal employment. So we all can talk about that today, and I'll be ready for all of your questions, hopefully at the end. So Nathaniel, do you want to go ahead with the next slide?
Yeah, sure. And so the first slide that we have, we're going to take your questions at the end, but right now we have a question for you. How far have you gotten in the federal hiring process? I'm going to launch the poll right now. So the options are, I have never applied to the U.S. government. I am in the middle of an application. I received a phone interview. I have done an in-person interview, or I work or have worked for the U.S. government, and that can be as a contractor or an employee. All right, and I am going to be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. And here are the results. We have 50% have never applied to the U.S. government. 11% are in the middle of an application right now, so I'm sure that's why they're tuning in. 17% have gotten to the point where they've gotten the phone interview, and another 17% are currently or have in the past worked for the U.S. government. So there you have it. I'll go ahead and hide these results now and go on to the next slide for you, Jan.
Great. Well, that's terrific. That's really helpful for me to know. And those of you who are in the middle of an application or who are or have worked for the federal government, hopefully you can help me with some of these answers. But one of the things that I always like to review is why bother with the federal government? Everybody knows it's a challenge, some would say hassle, to apply for a job in the federal government. People know that it takes an incredibly long time. So, there are downsides to going to work for the federal government. But let me tell you a few of the advantages. And these actually are the case no matter what your political persuasion. And we can tackle that topic as well later in this discussion. But the reality is that there is no place else you can go to work where you can have the breadth and the depth of impact on other people's lives and on the condition of the country, the world, the climate, the universe, however you want to look at it. This is a place where I was incredibly fortunate. I got a bill passed and I was able to help and offer a benefit to 20 million people in the country. And I just ran a really small agency compared to all of the others out there, like Homeland Security, Department of Defense, or the VA. But the reality is that you can make a tremendous difference. And I know that's a motivation for many people who are interested in federal employment. The other one is that you can work in just about any field of interest. If you go to work for a tech company, you're going to have a range of occupations that are open to you. If you go to work in traditional manufacturing, there'll be a finite number of occupations. The federal government hires somebody doing just about everything you can think of, and many occupations that you probably never thought about. So that's also a very attractive part of federal employment. Once you're in the government, you can move around. You can change fields. If you decide you want to go to work for the Department of Labor, once you get your civil service standing, you can move to NASA. You can move to the USGS. You can move to the Department of Agriculture. I mean, it's very, very easy to make lateral moves that either can help you with changing interests or can accommodate any changing interests, or even accommodate your family or personal situation. If you have a spouse who gets a job in Kansas, there are federal jobs in Kansas and you can apply for those. So it provides, because it's so big, it provides a degree of flexibility that you often don't get with other employers. The next one's a little bit facetious, see the world, but it's true. There are federal employees in every county in the United States, but more importantly, there are federal employees in every country around the world. So if you have an interest in travel or moving around, you can literally find a job just about anywhere you decide you want to live or explore. The federal government, even though the conditions of employment are changing and President Trump has his own ideas on how the civil service system should evolve, the reality is that there are still a lot of opportunities for promotion. For example, I worked in the nonprofit that I really believed in its mission, but it was a small organization. It was about 25 people. We didn't have a lot of layers. I mean, we were broad-based, but there weren't a lot of layers. And so the opportunity for promotion, to grow in a job, to become a supervisor really was limited. That is not the case in the federal government. Really, there are just tremendous opportunities, not only horizontally with other agencies or even other occupations, but also moving up in the ranks. And then finally, the federal government does have a commitment to professional development. So if you've chosen a field that is experiencing a lot of change, a lot of discovery, I would imagine anybody in the sciences realizes this is a part of your jobs, your profession. The reality is that the federal government does have a commitment to professional development. Every so often, there's a bit of a rollback on that when there's perhaps a scandal about people who attend conferences or the amount of money spent on travel. But overall, there is a commitment to making sure people can keep up and actually stay ahead with their education, with their training, and with their profession going forward. So Nathaniel, can you go to the next slide? There are ways that you can increase your chances of getting a job. And this slide to me is very, very important because it outlines what the Office of Personnel Management has determined to be urgent hiring needs in the federal government. This is where there aren't enough applicants and there are shortages. So if you can find a way to relate to any of these, and you'll notice there's a ton of science jobs here, engineering, computer science, but most importantly, biological sciences, physical science, chemistry, all of the things that you do and that you all are trained in is really in a shortage situation for the federal government. So if you can find jobs in these fields, you will have a much, much easier time. That's not to say that there aren't openings in other fields if you'd rather do something different, but these fields, people are actively looking, recruiting. This will up your chance of really getting through the process and getting hired. Next slide. There are two main ways to get into the government. One is the Pathways program for students or new professionals. The other is USAJOBS.gov. And I'm going to say I was the person who launched USA Jobs. I know it's not perfect. I know that not every administration has invested in it to keep it going, but it has provided a degree of transparency, a more streamlined way to search for all of the vacancies across government. But I'm going to go over each one of these. And you will see that I have a very, very strong preference for the programs that are in the Pathways program. Those are much easier to access and much easier ways to get into federal service. And then there's a few alternatives we'll go over that may be outside both of those streams to federal employment. So we can go to the next slide, Nathaniel. So the first one, this is within Pathways, is the internship program. I don't know how many of you are still in school, but if you are a student enrolled at least half time, you should take a look at going for a federal internship. Now, it's interesting because when people hear internship, they think work for free. That is not the case in the federal government. The federal government has only limited situations where they are permitted by law to use volunteers. You've seen some of them. If you've gone to a national park or something, there'll be volunteers there. But most of the time, you have to be paid. So that's the good news. These positions are also accepted from the competitive service, which means if you identify a position that you're interested in, they don't have to go through a big, extensive process to fill that job. They can just decide you're the one and put you in it. The one caveat to that is virtually every job in the federal government is subject to veterans preference. So if you are a veteran, that'll be a great advantage to you. If you aren't, that does not mean you can't get hired. It just means you have additional applicants for every position. But you're not going to have to, in these jobs, you're not going to have to be assessed against a ton of other people. If you fit the qualifications, an agency can hire you directly. Now, each agency controls these positions. There's no need for any kind of central application or, filling in something that goes into a big pool. Chances are you'll be filling out an application on USA Jobs that goes directly to the agency, because there is a requirement that every internship be posted on the USA Jobs website. Now, how do you find these? Used to be that you'd have to go agency to agency and look up internships and see what they said on their website about it. Now, all of these opportunities are focused and concentrated on the USA Jobs website. Take a look at this specific link. It has a usajobs.gov that all of you should commit to memory, /students and grads. And that website will have all of the opportunities for students and new professionals. So it'll all be concentrated right there for you. If you get a job, you are going to be asked to essentially execute a contract with the agency. You and the agency are going to sit down and agree on what it is you're going to do, what your duties will be, and what you're going to achieve in the time frame that you're being hired for. The beauty of that is if you complete all of those requirements, you can be converted to a permanent competitive service position. That gives you standing in the civil service. It cannot be taken away from you except for cause or malfeasance, and it is a ticket to a federal career. Once you have that standing in the federal service, that's when you can do the things I've been describing. That's when you can move around. That's when you can take the opportunity to change locations, change departments, change fields. So keep that in mind. This way of getting that civil service standing is far easier than most others. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about those of you who are no longer in school, but maybe recent grads within the last 2 years. Oh, wait, we're going to do a poll, right?
Yeah, we're actually going to jump in here with this poll so they can actually answer that question themselves. So the question is, where are you at in your career? And you can see the options there: current undergrad student, current graduate student, early career, mid-career, or late career. And I'm going to give everyone just a few more moments to respond. And I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And the results are 25% are current graduate students, 63% identify as early career, 4% are mid-career, and 8% are late career.
Great. Right. Well, this is really helpful because this will actually help me decide how much time to spend on everything here. I can pretty much breeze through the recent graduates program, although those of you who are in grad school and those of you who graduated within the last 2 years are eligible for this, and you really should take a close look at it if you're in that demographic. So this is a more structured role than the internship. It's a 1-year program. It comes with an assigned mentor who has committed to spending time with you to help you with your career, not only in the job you have, but also to provide advice for an ongoing federal career, and 40 hours of training. Now, those of you who may have experience in the private or nonprofit sector, you'll realize that 40 hours is pretty significant. Again, going back to that commitment that the federal government has to really help their employees keep up with developments in their field and help them grow so that they can have promotions and advancement with their jobs and their careers. Once again, you will not have to compete with a whole horde of people. It is accepted from the competitive service, but veterans' preference does apply. So if there is a veteran who is as equally qualified as you are, they will have preference for hiring, but that should not hold you back from pursuing one of these positions if you're interested and not a vet. Again, same website, that's /students and grads, critical for any of you who fall into these categories. Nathaniel, do you want to click over to the next? There we go. Again, another participant agreement is required. This will be a back and forth, a negotiation. But again, the beauty, if you meet all of those expectations, if you live up to what you said you would do and that what you agreed with your agency you would do, you can convert to a permanent competitive service position. So you could actually stay in the same job and one day you're in this recent grads program, the next day you're a civil servant, giving you, again, that ticket to move around the government and do pursue the kind of career you're interested in. Next slide. This one is very interesting. I don't know if any of you have heard about the Presidential Management Fellows. It's the most prestigious leadership and early career program in the federal government. It is incredibly competitive. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if anybody has any questions, let me know. There's always a lot of interest in it. There are always a lot of applicants. It's a very rigorous assessment, but it is a very different selection process, not the typical job interview. There's lots of interviews, panels, you talk to different people. You need references and recommendations written from professors, from colleagues. So it's a very different approach to hiring. And again, it is for people who have graduated within the last 2 years. Can you go to the next slide, Nathaniel? These are paid positions, and they're at a little bit higher level. Most federal employees don't start at this level. So again, very structured. It's a 2-year program. It comes with a senior level mentorship rather than perhaps someone in mid-management or more of a peer. This is someone at the top levels of government. 160 hours of formal training over those 2 years. That is 4 full weeks. And at least one developmental assignment so that you can see another workplace where you can experience a different kind of program. So you will, even though you may love the job that you have, the reality is that you will have to spend some time in a different position. So this program is so exclusive, it has its own website. So if you're interested in it, take a look at pmf.gov. Obviously, that's short for Presidential Management Fellow, pmf.gov. And I'll just say that once you become a Presidential Management Fellow, you are pretty much ensured a position after these 2 years. The federal government makes a serious commitment and investment in each one of the fellows, and I don't know anyone over the last 20 years who wanted one and did not get a permanent placement. So very important, very prestigious, really the future leaders of the federal government at the career level, not the political level. This is still career positions, but also on the flip side, extremely competitive. Next slide, Nathaniel.
Sure. And the next slide is another poll. So before we start moving into the USAJobs.gov section, just want to ask everyone if they've ever used USAJobs.gov before, so we can see what kind of audience we have as far as familiarity with USA Jobs. And I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And it looks like there's quite a bit of familiarity with it. We have 12% that have never been to USAJobs.gov, and I imagine they're typing it in their browser right now. 38% used it once but haven't been back since. Maybe they saw a job they liked, and so they had to go through USAJobs.gov, but maybe after this they'll be going back to it. And then 50% have applied to multiple positions through the platform.
That's great. Those of the 50% of you who've done it more than once, you probably know more about it than I do. I did apply for one job through USAJobs.gov, and I did get an offer. I declined the position, but it does work. There are job offers that come out of this, but we can talk more about it. The beauty about USA Jobs, and the one thing that works well, it can be incredibly complex. It is a huge website. It gets 20 million hits a year. There's a tremendous amount of information on there. As I mentioned before, virtually every federal job has to be posted on USAJobs.gov. So you can only imagine, out of a civilian workforce of 2.7 million, the kind of churn, the kind of positions, the number and breadth of positions that are on there, it can be overwhelming. And I understand that, and I'm extremely sympathetic to everybody who's trying to navigate this. But all of you are very talented. This is a generation that is much better at the digital world than when I started this 20 years ago. So here are the ways you can look for a job. So obviously, department and agency. You have your heart set on working at the Department of the Interior. You can just look at what's open at the Department of the Interior. I mean, so that's an easy one. You want to work for a national park or at a national park, you can look at the National Park Service. That helps narrow the search for you. You can look at a keyword. You like lab work. You like field work. You can sort of do things like that that might be interesting to you. You like geology. Throw that in there. Space exploration. See what you got just through your typical keyword search. You can look at location. You know, there's an assumption that the federal government is based in Washington, D.C. It is based in Washington, D.C., but there's only about 350,000 federal jobs here. Now, that's quite a concentration, but as I mentioned before, there are federal jobs in every county in the country. So if you want to be in Omaha, Nebraska, you can look it up that way, and you'll only see jobs that are in Omaha or nearby. You can look at occupational series and job categories. If you are dead set on a specific occupation, a specific role, if you look up a job and you see something that you can relate to, you will see a number on there called an occupational series and job category. Write down that number, because you can search with that number and you can see all of those jobs all across the government. So again, you want to be a hydrologist. Once you hone in on a hydrology job, you can find the number, the occupational series number, and use that in all of your searches. You can look at posting dates. What are the ones that are the latest ones? What are the ones that were posted in the last week that are fresh, that haven't been hanging around for the last couple of months? So that'll help you know what's new out there, in case you've been on and off the site over the last 6 months, let's say. If you have a minimal amount of money you want to make, nobody has a maximum, so I won't ask about that. But if you have to make, if you've done a budget in your family, you have to make $35,000 a year, you can put that in as well, that you only want to see positions that pay $35,000 and up. You can look at the type of work. Again, I've mentioned this before. You should look at who can apply. This is a very different kind of employer. So some positions will be reserved for existing federal employees. Now, that is why I am such an enthusiast for that Pathways program, for the internships and the recent grads, because you get that ticket punched if you go through one of those entrances to federal work. So once you get that standing, then you could apply to just about everything. You can look at work schedule. If you need a flexible work schedule, if you've got to be home for 3 o'clock to meet a child after school, you can look it up that way. Obviously, things like that will limit the options that pop up for you, but you still can do it. And then my personal favorite, which I think is so important, you can look it up by academic major. So if you majored in seismology, if you majored in geology, whatever your major, you can just look it up that way. And that will give you all of the jobs that are related to that. So that's why that one has an asterisk, not because it's any more special than any other, but to me is just very, very appealing, particularly to people who are early career. Next slide. So there are some things that you should think about. You potentially can get a tremendous number of results for your searches, no matter which one of those categories you type in. It could be overwhelming. So how do you think about putting limits on it? So first of all, I mentioned geographic location. You know, if you say, I want to be a geologist, you're going to get every geologist job around the world. If you know you have a child who's entering their junior year of high school and you're not moving for 2 years because you want that child to finish their education at that particular high school, limit yourself by geography, and that will just help make the results more manageable. Look at the specific job title. I talked about the occupational series. If you want to be a supervisory hydrologist, and that's what you have your heart set on, only look at those titles and you'll be able to get much more of a sense of what's available to you and what's out there that meets your needs. Again, a specific agency or department. My one caution with that, and this is one place where I always like to offer a little bit of extra advice, which, you can or cannot accept. But if, for example, I meet a lot of people who say to me, I want to work at the State Department. Okay, tell me why. Well, I love international work. I want to travel. I want to spend some of my career outside the United States. I want to be able to go back and forth. Well, that's great. But what you have to realize is that virtually every department in the federal government has an international component and very likely has international programs. So, think broadly when you're thinking about the ways to focus and limit your search, but also don't limit it to the extent that you're going to disqualify yourself or you're going to make it harder to come up with jobs to apply for. And then finally, the last one that all of you should think about is that there are many ways to serve the government. We live in a political time where there is an emphasis on outsourcing. A lot of government functions have been shifted over to the private sector. I'm not going to get into whether that's good or bad. We can have a whole webinar on that if you want, so we'll have Nathaniel organize that. But the reality is that that's what it is. And this is a great example here. If you're interested in space exploration, yes, you can go work at NASA. And NASA is an incredible agency. They always show up every year as the best place to work in the federal government in all the surveys. So yeah, if I could, I'd go work at NASA too. But we all know just by reading the newspaper that there are now a lot of private sector enterprises who are in the space business. There are organizations that do nothing but put up commercial satellites. You've got Tesla, you've got all of these people, SpaceX, all of these organizations who are involved in space exploration. So while this slide says when to limit yourself, I would offer that the last two things I've discussed kind of argue for looking very, very broadly. It won't have the same benefits. It won't have the same compensation structure. You actually may make more money in the private sector, but you just have to think very, very broadly. How important is this work to you? And if this is exactly what you want to do, I would urge you to look at government, but not only government, but who in the private sector is also doing this kind of work. Next slide. So how do you get noticed? So you're on USA Jobs, you've done a great search, you've figured out 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 jobs that you want to apply for. Let me just give you some hints. First of all, read through the information on usajobs.gov. There's a tremendous amount of tips on there and how-tos. It can be overwhelming, but if you want to get a federal job, it's worth investing the time. So look at the job announcement. Don't just slap up a resume up there and click submit. Read it carefully. The reality is that you should tailor your resume to the job. If you just have a generic resume that you're sending in for every kind of job that appeals to you, you are unlikely to get noticed, in part because the first screening of your resume is likely to be done by a machine, a computer. So you have to realize that there are, most of these jobs will attract a lot of applicants, so make it very, very specific. So when you go through a section on the job announcement called Duties and Qualifications, do pay attention to that and address each one of those and talk about what you have done and the results you got. I say if you see keywords in a job announcement, replicate them in your resume. They're not trademarking words on usajobs.gov. So if there's a job that says supervisory experience, developing employees, and you have experience doing that, call it supervisory experience. Don't say, I was a leader among men and women. That's great, but they're looking for the term supervisor or supervisory experience. Give them what they want. Give them what they're asking for. Again, be specific. What, why, how, and start with the results. Put the most important items at the top. Make sure they know what you've accomplished. I have a colleague who talks about, don't make this a police report. And if any of you watch Law and Order and all, you'll know that when the cops file a police report, they say the first emergency call came into the 911 center at 7:26 p.m. The first patrol car arrived at 7:35. And they'll go through all this detail, and you flip and you flip, and you realize on page 4, not only was it a homicide, but they were able to solve the case. Put that in the front. This is what I handled. I handled a tough assignment. It was a homicide. I figured it out. That's the result. That's what you want at the top. In the federal government, don't worry about length. In the private sector, everybody says 2 pages, 3 pages. Again, we can debate that for a very, very long time. Don't worry about that as much in the federal government. Give them everything they're asking for. Next slide. You should go ahead and include volunteer experience. Experience is experience. The federal government doesn't care whether you got paid for it or not. Tell a story, right? But tell a story with the ending at the beginning. So write in the first person. Use action words. Use examples. If you got an award and a recognition, brag about it. And finally, the most important thing is don't lie. That is the kiss of death on a federal application. You may get the job, but you will not pass a background check, and you will be asked to leave. So no matter what kind of bad news you may have, don't lie. A lot of things can be overlooked. A lot of things can be explained. You shouldn't lie. Pay attention to deadlines. Pay attention to the details. These are organizations that have had a tremendous amount of legal and regulatory obligations instituted or placed on them. They have to comply. If a job vacancy says the application is due at 5 p.m., you don't get till 5:15. They'll cut it off at 5, because then all of a sudden they're getting into fairness and equity. And why did they accept yours when they didn't accept the person's application that came in a minute later? They're serious about this. You have to be very detail oriented too. Next slide. Finally, there are things that are very, very similar to the private sector. So, so far we've talked about mostly how the federal government is a different job search process than the private sector. There are things that are much like the private sector. First of all, be visible, make yourself known. Call the contact person on the job announcement. Every vacancy announcement on USA Jobs has the name of somebody. Give them a call. Now, you may not get the welcome mat laid out for you every single time, but you may break through, in which case you can get some really good advice. You can ask about the kind of experience they're interested in, the kind of education. Do an informational interview. Even if it's not that person, get online. All of you are great researchers. Go online, figure out who works in that program, in that agency, in that office, and pick up the phone and ask them if you can come in for an informational interview. Visibility, being known, being a known factor, all of that will help you the same way it does in the private sector. Next slide. Again, in the visibility. Get involved in professional groups. I'm going to put in a big plug here for AGU and its conference. There are a lot of people walking around there. When you go to a panel or a session at the AGU conference and somebody's presenting where you'd love to work with them or you'd love to work in their program, walk up to them afterwards and talk to them about it. You know, to ask them if you can be in touch with them. Ask if you can send them your resume. A lot of professional societies have local chapter events. For example, I'm very involved. I'm actually past president of the American Society for Public Administration. Those are people who work for the federal government, local government, state government. Go to those chapter events. Find out what they're holding. The ones that are held in Washington, D.C. are always free. They just choose not to charge people. So they're open to anybody. It's a great place to network. The federal government will attend job fairs. They will put up a booth when they're looking for specific kinds of people. Find out where they're going to be and show up. Next slide. I don't have to tell this crowd, use social media. And the reality is, like I said, there are 2.7 million civilian workers in the federal workforce. Chances are someone in your network or your friends' networks is a federal employee. Do some asking around, ask a lot of questions, and spend time with that person and see what kind of advice they can give you. Next slide. So finally, I know we wanted to save a little time for Q&A. Hopefully this is enough time, but if you think of something after this, this presentation, after the webinar, there's my email address. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to hear from you, and let me know how you're doing and what progress you're making. Nathaniel, next slide.
Yeah.
I think
We're here. We have arrived to the Q&A portion. I'm going to give everyone a little bit of time to go ahead and write in their questions before I start up with the ones that we already have. Recognizing that we only have 10 minutes. While you are typing those in, I just want to point out that we have a whole slew of webinars coming up in the next month. We have one on science communication. We have one on the AGU Narratives program with AGU Centennial and how to use the StoryCorps app. There's another one on the upcoming budget that'll be April 5th. And continuing along with this series that we've done, we did Introduction to Academia last month, and we're doing federal jobs this month. Next month, we're going to be doing an introduction to the private sector, and that will be on Thursday, April 19th. So yeah, you can find all of those if you just go to webinars.agu.org, and you can register from there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start in with some of the questions that we do have. The first one that I'm going to start with is, could you discuss the different GS levels? For example, what level should one look for if they've recently completed their PhD or they're a postdoc?
That's a really great question, and it's slightly different in every agency, but most agencies will start you at a GS7. There are exceptions, so sometimes it can be a 9. For some reason, they go in odd numbers, 5, 7, 9, 11, then it starts 12, 13, 14, 15. But I would at least be open to a GS7 position. And then in some agencies or in some hard to recruit occupations, it may bump up to a GS9.
Yeah, so just because it's PhD specific there, I know in my experience with the agencies that I've worked with or applied to, I would say that typically graduate level work is probably, and this does vary agency to agency, but in my experience, the ones that I've gone with, it's been like 9 and 11. are around the master's level, 11 and above maybe for PhD. And it also depends on how much like work experience you carry with that PhD, because you probably have field work and lab work experience. That probably will factor in a little bit, but it very much depends on which agency. So like another way to look is, because the requirements are going to be in the job description. So you can sort of gauge within the agency, if you look at a couple of different postings and look at the difference between, the 7s, the 9s, the 11s, and what requirements they're expecting as far as your education go, that can be an easier way to gauge as well of what you should be looking at and what you should be going into. Let's see.
If you're applying for a difficult to recruit position, the grade will go up. So take a look at that list that I gave you all early on, and if you can somehow fit into one of those categories, typically those positions will pay more.
So the next one I got here is, are all federal jobs limited to U.S. citizens? Can non-U.S. citizens apply for any federal jobs?
There are very few very few positions are open to non-citizens. There will be some at the State Department, at USAID, Agency for International Development. A lot of them are overseas. We will hire, and there is a priority to hire foreign nationals in the countries where the government has a presence, either a military or diplomatic or programmatic presence. So those are probably where most opportunities would be. Otherwise, you typically do have to have a U.S. citizenship.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the person that asked this question just dropped out, but she wanted to know about salary requirements and how to figure that out. And you don't have to answer this, Janice, because I included a link to the cost of living table that's on OPM in the handout that we have.
Great.
So folks can just follow that URL to figure out for the region they're applying to what the salary range is.
Yeah.
And yeah, OPM will answer that a little bit better.
It's a combination of every year. There's a combination of government-wide increases and locality based. So it takes into account the cost of labor, not even the cost of living, the cost of labor in major metropolitan areas. So San Francisco, some very high cost competitive areas will pay more for the same job than they might in Houston, Texas.
Here's a great question. What is your recommendation for evaluating yourself in response to questions on applications? Like they'll say, like I'm not very familiar with this particular skill. I'm adept at this skill. I exceed and above average in this skill. So how would you recommend responding to those questions when you're rating your level of experience?
Okay, so this one is a challenge, and it's a test in a way. If you evaluate yourself as being outstanding on every score, you probably won't have much credibility. But don't be too hard on yourself. If you have experience in an area or experience or you've exhibited or worked somewhere where you had to use a particular skill or competency and you did a good job, be good to yourself. Because if you say either no experience or not very good or whatever the scale is, if you say that too many times, you just won't be considered for the position. They're asking about those skills and competencies for a reason. Chances are because they're an integral part of that job. So even in your own mind, if you realize you just haven't done a lot of this, for example, I'm a lawyer. So if someone asks me a lot of skills that would be obvious and common for someone in a science field, I'd have to be very honest with myself and say, maybe this isn't the job for me. But if you've done it and you can point to an example or discuss a situation where you successfully used or called on a skill or a talent or some knowledge that you have, be generous, be good to yourself.
All right, thanks. Yeah. The next one that I have here, how do you get a human to look at your CV and application submitted through USA Jobs? And I think that you kind of touched on that when you're talking about the application process, that when you're responding to questions, if it's like a short form answer or an essay form answer, you definitely want to use the keywords that they used in the job description, because that's going to be what the computer is looking for.
Absolutely. And again, you can't just send the resume that you have pulled together for every job you apply for. You really do have to spend the time to customize it. Now, you can do some cut and paste. I mean, this is my background because I've done a lot of different things in my career. I have a paragraph for, federal government work. I have a paragraph for professional societies. I have some points that I make if I'm applying for a job at a foundation where I've worked before. After a couple of applications, you will have a menu to choose from. So I'm not saying you have to throw it away every time and start over, but you do have to be responsive to that application and what that job is looking for in applicants.
Okay, so I'm gonna the final question I'm gonna throw at you, because we have just a few minutes left here. It's a little bit of a curveball, and you might not have an answer, or at least not an official answer. So the question is, I've heard conflicting information about hiring freezes across the federal government. Can you speak to the status of freezes in general, and maybe how common they are?
Sure. I love talking about hiring freezes. So typically what you probably heard about was the freeze that President Trump put in place when he came into office. He is not the only president to do that. Typically, a new president will just want to stop, get the lay of the land, make sure that the people that are coming on board fit their priorities, what they're looking for. That is not unusual. But let me tell you about this most recent hiring freeze. It was Swiss cheese. There were so many exceptions that hiring continued almost unabated. You almost couldn't tell that there was a hiring freeze on. He exempted anything that had to do with the military. So that's pretty much the entire Department of Defense, right? That's 500,000 people right there. Anything that had to do with veterans, anything that had to do with public health and safety, the transportation safety, Homeland Security, all of those things were accepted. And then each agency head also could ask for exceptions. So if they had some kind of situation where they were trying to stand up a program or stand up some work in the field or something, or maintenance at a national park or whatever, they could ask for exceptions. So the reality is, don't let hiring freezes psych you out. Stay on USA Jobs, see what's available. There will be some contraction because agencies are going to want to be able to demonstrate that they're paying attention to their leader, whether he's new or not, or whether it's imposed because of a budget freeze or, an appropriations crisis or whatever. but there are still jobs that are being filled every single hour of every single day. So keep looking. Don't worry a lot about a hiring freeze. It's mostly to get the headlines.
Well, thanks for that, Janice, and thank you for the entire presentation. I want to thank everybody who attended today. I hope that we got to your questions. If we didn't, as Janice said, you can contact her afterwards. And I'm going to leave that up there just for a moment. We do hope that you guys will continue to join us. We try to do these every Thursday. Next week will be a slight exception because it'll be next Monday. But generally, these are Thursday, 2 to 3 p.m. Thank you again, Janice, and thank you everyone for attending. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.